The Haunting of Room 217. Sarah had always been skeptical of ghost stories, but her job as a night shift nurse at Oakwood Hospital was about to change that. The old building had its share of urban legends, but none as persistent as the tales surrounding Room 217. It was a quiet Tuesday night when Sarah first encountered something unexplainable. As she made her rounds, she noticed the call light for Room 217 was on. Strange, she thought, as the room had been empty for weeks. She approached the door, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. As she reached for the handle, a chill ran down her spine. The door was ice cold to the touch. Sarah took a deep breath and pushed it open. The room was dark, save for the dim glow of medical equipment. As her eyes adjusted, she saw a figure sitting on the bed. "Excuse me," she called out, "are you all right?" The figure didn't respond. Sarah fumbled for the light switch, her heart racing. As the fluorescent lights flickered to life, she gasped. The bed was empty. Over the next few weeks, Sarah experienced more inexplicable events in Room 217. Lights would flicker, equipment would turn on and off by itself, and sometimes, in the corner of her eye, she'd catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure. Her colleagues brushed off her concerns, attributing them to stress and an overactive imagination. But Sarah knew something was wrong. One night, curiosity got the better of her. She decided to investigate the room's history. In the hospital's dusty archives, she discovered a chilling truth. 50 years ago, a patient named Emily had died in that very room under mysterious circumstances. As Sarah delved deeper into Emily's story, strange occurrences in Room 217 intensified. Objects would move on their own, and Sarah often felt an unseen presence watching her. The breaking point came on a stormy night. As Sarah entered Room 217 for her routine check, the door slammed shut behind her. The lights began to flicker violently, and in the strobe-like effect, she saw a figure materialize at the foot of the bed. It was a young woman in an old-fashioned hospital gown, her face gaunt and eyes hollow. "Emily?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The apparition raised a bony finger, pointing accusingly at Sarah. In a raspy voice that seemed to echo from the walls themselves, it spoke, "You don't belong here. Leave, or join us." Sarah screamed, fumbling with the door handle. As she finally wrenched it open and fled into the hallway, she could hear the ghostly laughter echoing behind her. From that night on, Sarah refused to enter Room 217 again. The hospital administration, concerned about the rumors circulating among the staff, eventually sealed off the room permanently. To this day, patients and staff report strange noises and unexplained shadows near the sealed door of Room 217, a chilling reminder that some secrets refuse to stay buried. The Whispering Forest. Mark had always been an avid hiker, but nothing could have prepared him for what he encountered in the depths of the Blackwood Forest. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day solo camping trip, a chance to clear his mind and reconnect with nature. The first day went smoothly. Mark set up camp in a small clearing, enjoying the serenity of the woods. As night fell, he sat by his campfire, listening to the usual forest sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. But as the fire died down, Mark began to hear something else. At first, it was so faint he thought he was imagining it. But gradually, it became clearer, whispers, seemingly coming from the darkness between the trees. Mark tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the wind, or perhaps some hikers nearby. But as he strained to listen, he realized the whispers weren't in any language he recognized. They were rhythmic, almost hypnotic, and seemed to be getting louder. Unnerved, Mark retreated to his tent, zipping it up tightly. But the whispers persisted, now seeming to come from all around him. He barely slept that night, his dreams plagued by shadowy figures and unintelligible murmurs. The next morning, Mark convinced himself it had all been in his head. He set out to explore, hoping the day's hike would clear his mind. But as he ventured deeper into the forest, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The trees seemed to grow denser, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Mark realized with a start that he no longer recognized his surroundings. The map was useless, nothing matched up with what he was seeing. As panic set in, Mark tried to retrace his steps. But every path looked the same, every tree an identical sentinel in an endless green maze. And all the while, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Night fell quickly, and Mark was forced to make camp again. As darkness enveloped the forest, the whispers became a cacophony. They seemed to be calling his name now, beckoning him deeper into the woods. In the firelight, Mark saw movement in the shadows. Faces seemed to form in the bark of the trees, their mouths moving in sync with the whispers. He huddled in his tent, but the voices penetrated even there, filling his head with promises and threats. By morning, Mark was a wreck. He abandoned his campsite, running blindly through the forest, desperate to escape. But no matter how far or fast he ran, the whispers followed, growing louder and more numerous. As the sun began to set on the third day, Mark stumbled into a clearing unlike any he'd seen before. Ancient stone monoliths stood in a circle, covered in strange symbols that seemed to writhe and move in the fading light. The whispers reached a fever pitch, and Mark fell to his knees, clutching his head. Through tear-filled eyes, he saw dark shapes emerging from between the trees, converging on the circle. What happened next, Mark could never fully recall. He was found 3 days later by a search party, wandering on the outskirts of the forest, dehydrated and incoherent. To this day, Mark can't bring himself to go near any forest. And sometimes, in the dead of night, he still hears the whispers, calling him back to the depths of Blackwood Forest. The Midnight Caller. For weeks, the residents of Millbrook Lane had been plagued by a series of strange phone calls. Always at midnight, always from an unknown number, and always with the same chilling message. It started with the Johnsons at number 12. Sarah Johnson answered the phone one night, expecting it to be her husband working late. Instead, she heard a raspy voice that made her blood run cold. "I'm coming for you. Your time is almost up." The police were called, but they found nothing. They assured Sarah it was probably just a prank call. But the next night, at exactly midnight, the Taylors at number 8 received the same call. And the night after that, the Garcias at number 15. As the calls continued, fear gripped the neighborhood. People began staying up until midnight, dreading the sound of their phones. Some disconnected their landlines, only to receive the calls on their cell phones instead. The voice was always the same, always with the same message. But there was something else, something that the residents only realized when they began to compare notes. In the background of each call, almost too faint to hear, was the sound of a music box playing a haunting melody. The police set up surveillance, but the calls continued. They tried tracing them, but the signal seemed to vanish into thin air. As the weeks went by, the residents of Millbrook Lane grew haggard and paranoid. Then, one night, the pattern changed. At midnight, every phone on the street rang simultaneously. When the terrified residents answered, they heard not the usual message, but the music box melody, louder than ever before. As the last notes faded, a new voice spoke, a child's voice, filled with a terrible sadness. "You ignored me. You forgot me. Now it's too late." The line went dead, and in that moment, every light on Millbrook Lane went out. In the sudden darkness, the residents heard a sound that made their blood freeze, the tinkling of a music box, coming from outside their homes. Those who dared to look out their windows saw a small figure moving down the street. It paused at each house, its face turned up towards the windows. In the dim moonlight, they could make out the features of a young girl, her eyes empty black sockets, her mouth stretched in an unnatural grin. As suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The lights came back on, and the figure vanished. But the damage was done. Within a week, Millbrook Lane was deserted, its residents fled to escape the memory of that terrible night. Years later, an old newspaper article shed light on the mystery. Decades before the housing development was built, a young girl had gone missing in the area. Her body was never found, but among her possessions was a beloved music box, the very one heard in those chilling midnight calls. The cursed painting. When the Henderson family moved into their new home, they were thrilled to find an old painting in the attic. It depicted a somber-looking woman in Victorian-era clothing, her eyes seeming to follow you around the room. Despite its somewhat eerie nature, Alice Henderson was fascinated by the painting. She had it restored and hung it prominently in the living room, much to her husband Tom's dismay. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about those eyes. Their daughter, Lily, was the first to notice strange occurrences. She claimed she could hear whispers coming from the painting at night. Her parents dismissed it as an overactive imagination, but Lily became increasingly anxious, refusing to be alone in the room with the painting. Then Tom started having nightmares. In his dreams, he found himself in a dark, Victorian-era house. At the end of a long hallway stood the woman from the painting, her eyes now alive with malice. Every night, in his dreams, she would be closer, her bony fingers reaching out for him. Alice tried to rationalize everything, but even she couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that permeated their home. Objects would move on their own, doors would slam shut, and sometimes, out of the corner of their eyes, they'd catch a glimpse of a woman in a long, dark dress. The breaking point came when Lily woke up one night screaming. She said the woman from the painting had been standing over her bed, whispering something in a language she didn't understand. Desperate for answers, Alice researched the painting's history. She discovered it had belonged to a wealthy family in the 1800s. The woman in the painting was Cordelia Blackwood, who had been accused of practicing black magic. According to legend, she had cursed the painting with her dying breath, vowing to torment anyone who possessed it. Alice wanted to get rid of the painting immediately, but Tom insisted they destroy it to end the curse once and for all. As he took it down from the wall, he noticed something they had missed before, a small inscription in the corner: "Beware, for I am bound to this frame. Release me, and I shall claim what is mine." Before Alice could stop him, Tom had thrown the painting into the fireplace. As the flames engulfed it, an unearthly scream filled the house. The lights flickered violently, and a cold wind whipped through the room. When it was over, the painting was gone. But so was their sense of safety. For in destroying the painting, they had unknowingly fulfilled the final part of Cordelia's curse, releasing her spirit. In the weeks that followed, the haunting intensified. Cordelia's spirit, no longer bound to the painting, had free reign over the house. The Hendersons fled, leaving everything behind. The house stands empty to this day, a silent testament to the dangers of disturbing things best left alone. And sometimes, on dark nights, passers-by claim they can see a figure in the windows, a woman in Victorian clothing, her eyes scanning the street, perhaps searching for her next victims.